So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to switch over to my presentation. I'm kind of filling two roles today as the webinar host and then also as today's presenter. So welcome to the first installment of the 2018 Tree Board webinar series. We've got people attending from across the country, so welcome. We appreciate your interest and involvement. A little bit of background for me. My name is Leslie Moorman. I am the Executive Director for the North Carolina Urban Forest Council. We've been offering these tree board webinars now going, I think this is our 5th year, and all of the previous webinars are available on either our website or through our YouTube channel, and I will direct you there at the end as well. But today's topic, I'm going to talk about tree myths of proper planting. And this is coming from just my work experience here in North Carolina and in other states. Just some of the most common errors or misconceptions that I see in the landscape, or that through conversations and communication with different homeowners and folks out there in the landscape of what they think is the right way to plant trees or the right way to treat and care for a tree. So I've called them tree myths because they've been repeated so much out there over time that people just take them as truth. So I'm hoping that through this presentation, you'll get a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more understanding of how to properly plant trees, but then also some tips that you can then relay to your neighbors and friends for maybe forwarding the message on how to properly plant trees. All right, so myth 1, planting location doesn't really matter. I see this happen a lot. A lot of times trees are an afterthought. There's not too much forethought put into the planting location because trees can grow anywhere. You give them an inch of soil and a spit of water and they will grow. They're pretty amazing creatures when you think about it. So, since they can grow pretty much anywhere, I mean, why should we put too much thought in there? But hopefully I'm going to debunk this a little bit and make people kind of think a little bit more about the site and the tree itself before moving forward, before actually planting the tree. We see this a lot in urban landscapes. On the left-hand side of the screen, that's actually a live oak in Charleston, and on the right is a cypress tree, actually from over in Italy, but still, you kind of drives home the point that trees will grow wherever we give them the opportunity to grow, whether it's putting their best foot forward and giving the best appearance or beauty factor is a whole nother discussion. But so I kind of want to get you guys thinking along the lines of, if trees can grow and they can look and produce these crowns in the shade and provide that kind of break to a harsh environment with just the littlest amount of space and care, what would happen if we actually put a little bit of thought into it and made a little bit more effort to provide decent planting spaces for these trees so that they can become the exquisite beings that they are and they provide the biggest benefit that they can possibly provide us. So what I wanted to reiterate here, and it's something that we've been, as the Urban Forest Council, trying to promote and educate folks on for probably going on a decade now, but it's the right tree, right place concept. Trying to think a little bit about, before you put that tree in the ground, what are some of the limitations of that site? What are some of the limitations of that tree species? Are there certain concerns that we need to have on the front end as far as pest problems in the area? Or, are we going to have limited maintenance options? You're not going to have the capability of maintaining that tree for the long run, so you need to make sure it's a tree species that's going to be able to take care of itself and handle that urban environment. So you need to think up front before you put that tree in the ground. Think about what the purpose of that planting is and what species might do best and perform best under that environment. So as I said before, historically, trees have been an afterthought. They're put in any empty space that might be there on the urban landscape. And we've been trying to kind of push that conception out of everybody's brains when they're dealing with development and construction, and make trees be thought about on the front end, because trees do have a purpose. They provide shade. You get to think about if you're looking for privacy from a neighboring homeowner or business, or a visual screen to the street itself. Certain tree species are going to be able to perform that function better than others. So if you think about the overall purpose of the planting, that'll help direct you to probably a better species for that location. But you also need to think about where that tree is being planted in landscape. And this is just, hopefully you guys are familiar enough with this illustration to know if, what side of the house or building you plant on provides different kinds of benefits. Whether you're planting an evergreen or deciduous provides a different amount of benefits, or different options there. But you want to be able to think about those things beforehand. Also think about above ground and below ground space constraints. If you've got utilities overhead, you want to be able to select tree species that are going to be a little smaller. So you want to make sure you plant maybe a 15, 20-foot tree on those locations. If you're going to be planting it closer to your house, you want to make sure you don't have a really broad crown. You want to be aware of if there's going to be enough below ground space for those trees to actually take root and get the nutrients and water that they need to produce those crowns. So you limit the amount of conflicts right from the start by selecting the right tree species for the right site location. Myth number 2, the distribution of tree roots below ground mirrors the canopy above. This is one that's really common out there for those folks that aren't necessarily tree people and aren't arborists. These are probably the 3 most common illustrations I've come across in literature and publications over my professional career. And this is what most people think of when they think of trees, that the crown above ground is a direct mirror image of what their root system looks like below ground. And this is common myth number 2, and it probably causes a lot of the problems we have with our tree health, because people think about root systems going down, not wide. And this is a pretty big misconception. Yes, some trees do have taproots. Most of the time, those taproots are only going to be in existence during their young, while they're juveniles, and they'll actually lose that taproot as they mature. And that's pretty standard and typical of most tree species. Deep taproots are typically a little bit more common with pine trees, but we found that that's their initial way of growing, so they get the stabilization right up front. And it also we don't see the taproots occurring or lasting as long, even in urban environments, because the soil in urban environments are so compacted that they just can't. They don't have the strength, the brute force behind it to get down that far. So you don't see taproots. What you'll actually start seeing, this is what people think of when they see of a tree root system. It's going to go down really, really deep. But what happens is they're actually only going to go within the first 18, 24 inches of the soil, and then they're going to spread out wide. They'll be on average 2 to 3 times as wide as the tree is tall. They'll go outside that canopy area, and that's how trees naturally grow. About 90% of a tree's roots are going to be in the top 24 inches of soil, and most of those will actually be in the top 6 to 18 inches of soil. So you don't need to plant deep. You don't need to make sure you have enough soil deep down. You want to make sure you have enough planting space wide, so those tree roots will actually be able to grow and stabilize that tree as it grows and gets tall, so you won't have as many conflicts or potential hazards. So this is just an old picture that I found. It kind of cracks me up a little bit that this is what people expect. They want the tree roots to go down really deep, and then we just don't find that, especially in an urban environment. Under the right soil conditions, if you have a really perfect, idealistic soil, you may be able to find some trees that do this. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, in an urban environment, you're not going to find this taking place. And most time, this is just a root plate. This is what you find. If you have, after a big storm event, if you're taking and a tree falls over, you'll see the root plate kind of come up, and it's a really flat plate-like in shape, and that's where, because tree roots are only going to be in the top 18 to 24 inches of soil. So this is the image you want to keep in your brain, and you want to have in your mind as you're selecting a right location for your tree. So if you want a really large growing tree, one of those oaks or something like that, you got to make sure you provide the soil space enough for them to grow like this, so that you won't have any kind of conflicts, or you won't have a tree that's going to get uprooted in a big storm event in the future. So this kind of leads us straight into number 3. It's an oldie but a goodie. You need to prune a tree at planting to balance out the root loss, because you've got, especially this is where this comes into play for like the ball and burlap trees. And a big misconception, and I think it's pretty much been debunked pretty much at this point, but it's not as common as it used to be. We've made a little bit of headway on this one, but they thought that because for ball and burlap, or for containerized where you're going to do some kind of root disturbance, that you need to go ahead and remove the crown to counteract that, so those tree roots don't have to provide as much water or nutrients to the crown. And that's a big no-no, and we've done fairly well of debunking this myth. Maybe too good of a job, because it's developed into never prune a tree at planting except for the dead, dying, diseased, and damaged branches. So this is a myth that's swung the whole 180 on the pendulum of always prune and do as much damage, much removal as you can to the crown to reflect what you've done to the roots, to never prune a tree. And the problem that this creates in the urban landscape is that in most municipalities and most homeowners, once they plant that tree, after that first few weeks to a few months when you're watering and mulching and kind of keeping an eye out for it, you're not going to come back to that tree. So what we've kind of started recommending is that we go somewhere right in the middle on this one. And if any of you guys are familiar with Dr. Ed Gilman out of Florida, he's now retired from the University of Florida, but he's still out there doing research and making presentations. So hopefully you guys are still familiar with him or hearing stuff from him. But he's done a lot of research and put out a lot of publications on young tree training. And what the general rule of thumb now for us now as arborists and tree care folks is that if you aren't going to be able to touch that tree again after you get it in the ground at planting, in the next 5 to 10 years, you want to go ahead and prune now to improve overall structure. And young tree training and pruning for structure is a whole other presentation I'm not going to get into on this one. But if you do see any crossing branches, if you see that there's codominant stems, you can go ahead and prune all that out at the time of planting, when you can actually get in there and do that stuff without requiring big equipment or a lot of time. Do that at planting so that you can get the correct structure and give that tree the best start. Myth 4, planting deep is better than shallow. And this came about quite a few years ago. We started seeing this happening in the urban landscapes. And I'm not sure where it started from and what got people thinking it, but I'm assuming that most of you guys have seen this in some way, shape, or form in the urban landscape throughout your life. Maybe you've done this yourself, in which case I'm here to correct your misconceptions. And I think where this came from was they wanted to stabilize that tree, and they wanted to make sure they got those tree roots down to where the moisture might be, and down below any of the compacted soil or whatever. I'm not really sure, but for a while there, all the recommendations that we were hearing from different landscapers and homeowners and those folks was that you want to plant that tree deep so it stays in the ground and can get the soil and get the roots growing into the soil as best you can. But we've kind of learned that planting a little shallow is actually better than planting too deep for a couple of different reasons, because you can cause some major root growth issues where you get girdling roots, or you get these kind of crossed over roots, or you can actually change the overall root structure. You can see on this one on the right that it's actually put on a whole nother level of roots because this tree was planted about 6 to 8 inches too deep. So its natural, root base starts here. You can start to see that's where its natural flare is. It was planted about 6 inches too deep. So it started, all those dormant buds under the bark turned into not tree limbs, but tree roots. And it's changed the overall structure of that tree. And you can create some pretty big root issues if you're not planting that tree correctly. So in general, planting a little shallow, and by a little shallow, I mean 1 to maybe 2 inches, nothing too extreme. And you want to be able to see that flare. I'm going to show you some pictures here coming up of what might be a good thing to see when you're planting a tree. But I want to draw attention to this. So this is why I wanted to point out what I meant by a little shallow, not anything extreme. You want 1 to 2 inches above grade as a maximum of shallowness. This is actually for anybody that might be on the conference or the webinar from the Raleigh-Cary area. This is from the Crossroads Shopping Center. It's a whole line of trees. There's cherries, there's Bradford pears, and there's maples all along this road. And every single one of them is planted like this. I'm not sure why I wasn't here when it was first installed 20 years ago, but we don't want to see this happening in the landscape. We don't want to be able to see half the root ball above grade. And whether this is a really wet site or a compacted site, and this is what their solution was, you're going to run into and create some really big problems. You can already see a lot of the damage here from lawnmowers when they come in and they mow this lawn strip. They run right over it and cause problems that way. But you can see that a lot of the structural roots, those larger roots right at the base of the tree, these are what would normally be, just below the soil, and that's where you get your structural integrity. That's where that's supposed to be what starts to hold the trees up, so they can handle a lot of wind and ice events. So you don't want to see this. This is bad. But I'm hoping that you guys are familiar with this image or this illustration here. It's just going to kind of quickly go over what you want to see when you are planting a tree. But you can see here, so this would be a ball and burlap. I think I also have an illustration here of a containerized tree and what it would look like. But you want to dig that hole only as deep as the root ball itself. And you can actually measure the depth of that by using the handle of a shovel. If you turn the handle upside down and you hold it up against the tree root ball or the soil portion, mark it with your hand along the stem, and then you use that to figure out if your planting hole is either too deep or too shallow. If it's too deep, go ahead and add more soil back in there. And you want to make sure you see that root flare. This one's not such a great image. I think the next one might be a little bit better, where you can see the flare at the base of the stem, base of the trunk, where it starts producing the roots. You want to have that at grade or just above grade. We have had some, I'm going to get into this a little bit more as the presentation goes on, but about mulch. You want to make sure you can mulch up to about where that root ball starts, maybe a little over it. You don't want to have that mulch touching the trunk itself. And you actually want to backfill with the soil that you've taken out of that the hole. And you don't need to necessarily amend it with any kind of compost or anything like that, because then you're just creating this really good environment for these tree roots, and they're going to stay. I mean, tree roots themselves are generally pretty lazy. They're going to stay where all the water is, where all the nutrients are. And if you create a really good atmosphere, good growing conditions right in that planting hole, but then all the soil outside that planting hole is left to be clay or subsoil or really compacted, you're going to find that the tree roots are going to stay right in that planting hole, and you're going to have some issues with circling roots and girdling roots as that tree continues to grow. So here's another picture of the containerized tree that I was talking about. With containerized trees, I wanted to go ahead and bring this up, is as those nurseries are growing those trees, they increase the container size. And every time they move that tree from one container to the next size up, they're adding more soil into it. And what you can find a lot of times is they have a lot of soil on top of that, the root system. A lot of times when you get a containerized tree, you might have, an inch to, sometimes I've seen it as far as 4 inches of soil up that main stem of that tree before you get to that topmost root. So for containerized trees, you want to go ahead and remove all the soil that you see at the top of the root ball until you reach that topmost root, and you want that flare and that top root to be right at or right above grade. This is a much better image of that. And then another thing I wanted to point out is you want to make sure that the actual slope of the planting hole itself is kind of sloped like this and not straight up and down. A lot of communities, a lot of parks and stuff, a lot of people will dig, if they're using an auger to drill the hole is one thing, but if you're going in there with a shovel, you just dig straight down. You want to make sure that the planting hole walls are sloped like that and not straight up and down. So if you're using a soil auger to dig those holes, or if you're digging them with the shovel and you're just going straight down, make sure you grade it out and slope it up, because that creates a much more hospitable environment for those tree roots to grow, and it'll help encourage root growth out of that planting hole itself, especially if you're using an auger, because what happens a lot with soil augers is as they drill down and create these holes, it's really quick and really easy to dig big holes for big ball and burlap or big containerized trees, but you create this really slick, compacted wall that these tree roots are going to grow into, and they'll just stay. It encumbers their growth into the surrounding soil and the surrounding landscape. So that's another thing to kind of point out there. Tree myth number 5: trees must be staked after planting. Remember back to your high school days, and you're getting ready to take your test for college entry, and they have those words in there about must and always and never. Whenever you see that or use that, that should be a red flag right there. Must be staked, always be staked. And this is kind of a point of contention with some people. And yes, there are certain situations where you should stake a tree if you're on a good hill site or an incline. If you're planting in the middle of a slope, you might want to stake a tree. Or if it's a really windy site and you get lots of gusts of wind, or wind tunnel effect between buildings and that kind of stuff, yes, definitely use tree stakes. And in certain situations, if it's a location that hasn't had a lot of trees in the past, and people aren't used to seeing trees there, or aren't used to having to maneuver around trees or maneuver equipment around trees, that might be another situation where you want to do tree stakes. Otherwise, people will run right over them with a lawnmower or with a bike or whatever. But for most situations, you don't actually need to stake a tree. So that's just something to be aware of. And goodness gracious, if you are going to stake a tree, do not use this hose and wire contraption that you've seen. I've seen most homeowners and a lot of municipalities used to do this, but this hose and wire thing is actually causes more damage and more harm to the tree than any kind of good it might be doing. There are a lot of other systems out there, and I'll show you a couple pictures of them. But you see this? These are reusable stakes. It's wood posts, but then they have these little what these are across here are actually reusable plastic arbor tie type thing that allows the tree to move some. But what happens with a lot of these staking systems is they're staked within an inch of their life, and those trees aren't allowed to move at all, and with any kind of wind event or anything. So then when you do remove those stakes, if you remove those stakes, the tree roots have not grown appropriately, and it's not able to stabilize itself. So what trees, for those of you that might not have a tree background of any kind, trees grow and put on wood reacting to the environment. So as the tree is growing, if there's some wind or some movement, it's shifting, that tree is going to tell the root system or the base of the tree to put on wood there to kind of stabilize it. So if you're staking this tree and you're not allowing any kind of movement and any kind of wind to kind of shift that trunk around, the tree's not going to put on root growth or diameter growth where it's needed to stabilize the weight of that tree. So when you do remove the staking system, you end up with a poorly formed root system that's not able to hold itself upright. So very rarely do you need to do this 3-stake system. These are all hose and wire, so I don't want to see any of this in the landscape at all. If you're going to do something, you can do this, or you can use arbor tie or even nylon stockings you can tie up with. Just don't do hose or wire, because it'll actually cut into the bark itself and girdle the tree that way. But this is something that I wanted to draw everybody's attention to. I don't know if you guys have seen this or been either seen it in demonstration at another workshop, or if you guys are actively using it in your municipal planning. But this is something I'm seeing and encouraging more across the landscape here. And it's a below ground staking system. So you don't get the tripping hazard that occurs when you use the above ground with ropes and arbor ties. It's a pretty simple system. It only takes a few minutes to actually install. And if you use untreated wood, it degrades on its own. You don't have to go back and remove anything. So it kind of simplifies the system. But so you use 2x2 stakes, and you can actually put 4, make like a little square around it, and you just hammer them into the soil itself. And then this one right here, this picture in the middle, they actually only use 3. So you can use either 3 to create a triangle or put a 4th one over here and create a square around it. So what you do is you just hammer those posts into the ground just to the outside of the root ball itself. And then you'll put supporting 2x2 untreated wood across them, so you get and it goes across the top of the root ball. If you can kind of see it here, this isn't the best diagram. You can look up some diagrams better to show you, or better yet, come to one of our Carolina Canopy workshops where I would actually demonstrate this in the ground for you guys. But so what you do is you hammer the stakes down, you put cross beams across the top of the root ball, and it will actually create this kind of platform that holds the root ball in place, but still allows the trunk itself to move in the wind. So the trunk will still move with breeze and wind and stuff. So it'll still put on the trunk flare and put on the root growth right there. But you're stabilizing the root ball itself, so you won't get any kind of upturned roots, and it's harder for people to remove those trees and pull them up, which does happen in some public locations. So you put those in, you would actually go back in, and then you cut off the top to make it flush with the posts the cross beams. And then you would put some dirt and some mulch over the top of it, and it's a hidden system. So you don't have any tripping hazards, you don't have anything that's going to draw attention to that tree, and you're keeping it stabilized in the ground. So I'm seeing this more and more across the landscape, and so far it's been pretty successful. And what I'm trying to keep educating folks on is to pull them away from this hose and wire technique. Because what happens is, if they get removed at all, it's not within the 1-year time frame in which you're supposed to remove a staking system for any of these kind of above ground systems, and you'll actually cause some compression of the cambium and the trunk itself. Which, if you do it like this 3 system, all 3 limbs over here on the left hand side, you've got 3 really weak points of weakness where that limb failure can take place. 9 times out of 10, once you plant a tree and stake it, they're kind of forgotten, and you can develop these points of where the whole thing is girdled and the wire itself grows into the trunk, and you can't remove it, because if you remove it, you're going to go ahead and essentially cut that tree off, or you can leave it there, and it's a point of weakness where if you get a lot of ice or a lot of snow or a really heavy windstorm, that's most likely where that tree fails. So if you're going to stake, don't use this staking system of hose and wire or any kind of wire type function, because you'll end up girdling the tree. You need to remove the stakes within 1 year, because by that time, that 1-year timeline, you will hopefully that tree will be stabilized enough that it won't need any more assistance there. And then, best option would be one of those below ground systems that I kind of showed you. There's more pictures of some problems, even with the arbor tie. So this arbor tie is kind of like a nylon webbing that's supposed to flex as the tree grows, and it doesn't damage the cambium as much as like a hose and wire system. But even if you leave those on for too long, you can still cause some moisture issues around that site. And just another really good image there of what you don't want to see happen if you leave on a staking system on for too long. Myth number 6, soil amendments are necessary when you have poor soil. Again, there's that necessary or always kind of thing. This used to be a pretty common practice where you would amend the soil of the planting hole itself, give it by either adding compost or adding some fertilizer or some growth kind of stimulant, like the moisture control thing over on the left-hand side there. It used to be a pretty common practice and a pretty common recommendation in the arborist world. And what we're finding, what research has actually shown, is the opposite. by adding that compost or adding that fertilizer or any kind of amendment at the time of planting, you create this really hospitable environment for these tree roots, and they're going to hang out there for longer and not go into the surrounding landscape, which just causes some structural issues as that tree grows. And then I also want to address that whole poor soil definition. It depends what a poor soil is, depends on who you're talking to and what the situation is and where your soil is located. Before you add any kind of fertilizer or amendment, you want to do a soil test. And there are some standardized fertilizers out there, but what they've actually found is by amending the soil of the planting hole itself, you're creating more problems than you are good. And if you are going to amend a soil, you want to amend it across the whole site, the whole landscape, or the whole planting bed on a larger scale. Because as you saw earlier, the tree roots aren't going to stay right at that canopy drip line. They're going to extend out 2 to 3 times as tall as that tree is. So you got to take scale into consideration. And to amend an entire site can take a lot of manpower and a lot of material. So you want to take that in consideration when you're selecting your site. But you also want to try to amend the soil before you plant the tree. So once that tree is in the ground, it's really hard to amend the site without doing any kind of damage to any of the trees that have been established there. And you want to do it across, as I said, the whole site itself, not just the planting hole itself. All right, so myth number 7, moving right along. Cutting roots or disturbing the root ball at the time of planting is bad for the tree. A lot of people believe that you've already done so much damage or shocked that tree at the time of planting, you don't want to do anything to the root ball. You just take it straight out of the container or straight out of the burlap, and then you put it straight into the hole. Don't disturb the roots because the roots are going to be needed. But what they've actually found, as I showed you before, especially with containerized, you see that, and this being a problem, is you get these circling roots that happen as they hit the containerized wall. They're going to hit it and they're going to grow either down or around the tree itself, and that's how they're going to keep growing if you don't disturb or cut those roots at the time of planting. So what you want to see, so if you see this, if you pull the tree out of the container or even out of the, if it's a ball and burlap, depending on how long it's been sitting there, you might see a little bit of this. It's less common in ball and burlap, much bigger issue with the containerized tree. You want to go ahead and cut those circling roots on the outside of the tree, and you can either do a clean cut with a pruning tool or use the shovel itself and cut through there. I have actually seen it recommended that you use a spade, a shovel, sharp edge shovel, and just kind of shear off the outside inch or 2 of the containerized tree, and that way you're getting rid of all of those containerized or those circling roots, either right on the outside or even further in on the root ball from when it hit a smaller container when it was younger. So there are a couple of different options there. But if you go ahead and take care of this now, when they're small, tiny roots, they can recover, and they'll anything about smaller than the width of like your pointer finger, the roots will regenerate pretty easily. So you don't have to worry about doing too much damage. But you want to take care of this at the time of planting. That way you're not creating a bigger issue, say 5-10 years from now once that tree is established and they've got much larger roots. Because larger roots are harder to, it takes longer, or if they don't regenerate at all, it takes longer for them to regenerate and recover from that kind of situation. So just another picture here on the left of what you see a lot from a containerized tree, and that's nothing necessarily that the nursery is doing wrong. Might have been in that container a little bit too long, or sitting in the at the nursery itself before being sold a little bit too long. But that doesn't mean it's a bad tree. You can fix it. It just takes a little bit of prep work on your end before you get in the planting hole. Another thing that I've seen is the picture on the bottom right. It's kind of hard to see sometimes, but you can see that foot there. So that's a shovel or spade, and what they actually did is cut down vertically, radially around that stem. So they not only did they shear off and take care of the outside roots, but they wanted to go ahead and address any circling roots that might have been taking place a little bit further in on that root ball, as that tree was small and it had that size container, then it was put out to that size container and then to that one. So they just went ahead, and I've seen this, and this is something that Ed Gilman recommends for some of the larger containerized trees, to go ahead and use a spade and just cut straight down radially around the container itself. And you can wait to do that once it's in the hole itself, just so that you have a stabilized tree. But that'll take care of any circling root issues. And yes, it looks like you're doing a lot of damage to those roots, but it's better to do that kind of thing when they're small and younger, so they can recover and actually establish properly formed root systems as they grow old. It takes, I mean, they do it pretty quickly. They'll regenerate and grow out into the soil pretty rapidly at this size. So it's when they get the bigger roots, and all of a sudden you have a maple tree in your landscape that you can see the roots going around and around, but the root itself is 2 to 3 inch diameter. You try and fix that at that point, you're doing a lot of damage to that tree. So this is just another picture of some surface roots and some circling, girdling roots. And you get this by planting too deep, planting in a really compacted urban soil, which so that's pretty much what we see in any home site or any urban tree planting location. So whatever we can do up front to counteract this is best. So if you can amend the whole site, if you can go ahead and take care of those girdling roots when the tree is younger, you won't see this kind of thing happen in the landscape. Myth number 8, and this is something that I've just seen left and right, and I was guilty of it for a few years back, and I've seen it happen. More, my neighbors all do it, my mom does it. You guys can go ahead and admit if you've done it, is tamping down and compacting the soil in the planting hole. So as you're filling and backfilling that soil, once you have the tree in the hole, you fill about halfway, and then you either use the butt end of the shovel itself, or maybe you step on it and heel it in. So what do you think you're doing? Yes, you want to stabilize that tree, make sure it doesn't go anywhere, it's not going to fall over, but you're also removing any kind of pore space that might have been there, any kind of air space you might have allowed or provided that tree for nutrients and air and water to be available. You're removing that. So, and trees aren't going to grow if there's not oxygen for them to grow, or moisture for them to uptake, or nutrients. So don't do this. You don't need to do it. There are a couple of options that I think I'll show you a little bit later. So these are probably the easiest and most common things I see. I have, you want to jump on it, make sure that tree doesn't go anywhere. If you ever see these things on a tree planting project site, scream, run, and to get those off those locations, because there's no reason for you to need this tamping, either one of these tamping tools for a tree planting location. Yes, you have to have the soil compacted enough for sidewalks, and that's appropriate. These tools are appropriate for sidewalks and maybe even some grass areas. I would hope not, but I can see and understand having to level things out that way. But if you see this on a tree planting location, that's a huge red flag. You're going to have all kinds of issues as those trees grow, and they're probably not going to survive for very long in that environment. What you can do is, instead of doing this kind of thing where you're pounding it in with your feet, jumping on it, or using the butt end of the shovel to tamp that tree down, is halfway, when that tree hole is filled halfway up, water it in. If you've got a hose or a bucket there, you can water in. The water will kind of get that soil a little bit more, less fluffy, compacted down. Or use the shovel head itself and just kind of, move it around in the planting hole and shift that soil around. It breaks up any kind of big soil clumps that you might have, and can get rid of the bigger, the really large pores that might have taken place, and they'll get that soil kind of down into the crevices without actually compacting it. So you don't need to tamp that soil down at the time of planting, because you're just compacting that site. This is where you might want to do those underground tree. If you're really worried about a tree moving and uplifting after you planted it, this is where you might want to do those underground staking systems. So that is a big no-no. Don't do it. Tree myth number 9. There's no such thing as too much mulch. This is a huge issue in North Carolina. I'm thinking that most states have this. It runs rampant. It's something that the landscaping world latched onto and ran with. I don't know if it came from You know, a homeowner wanting more bang for their buck. They want to see what their money is buying them when they hire a landscaper to do some mulching. But or if it's they don't want to have to come back and remulch it, you know, too soon. Whatever the cause, this is something that's been latched onto, and you get the mulch volcanoes. And this causes more harm. I mean, the whole point of mulching, you're trying to do good things, provide benefits to these trees, whether it's you know, stabilizing the soil, the temperature, so it's not going to be as big fluctuations in the summer heat or the winter cold, or providing some moisture. It's going to retain moisture closer to the tree roots themselves, and also to provide that nutrient breakdown, or the nutrients as the mulch breaks down. You know, mulch is supposed to be good, but too much mulch is really, really bad. This is something, I just have some pictures of different things that I've seen in landscape. You have these mulching mounds and just volcanoes that are horrendous. Some better than others, but still, I gotta scratch my head on why this is something that seems so hard to contradict and get people to stop doing. But so, you know, this is a pretty tame mulch volcano. It's only, you know, 5, 6, 7 inches deep. I've seen it where you got 12 inches of mulch going up the tree trunk itself. Mulch is good if done properly. And what you want to see, these are just more pictures, is you still want to be able to see the root flare at the base. You want to be able to see that flare. If you don't see that, if you get just a straight trunk, then you know you've got either too much soil or too much mulch at the bottom of that tree. So you only need about 2 or 3 inches of mulch. You don't want to touch the base of the tree. You want to keep it an inch or two away from the actual trunk itself, and the root systems itself. So start a couple inches away. Only need to put, you know, 3, 4 inches of mulch, and you want to extend that mulch ring out as far as you can. If it's to the drip line of the tree, just, you know, 2 or 3 feet, or even bigger. The more mulch area you have, you're going to be able to reduce any kind of conflict or competition it has with grass, because grass will take the moisture, you know, any kind of rain event, the grass is going to get that rain first. Any kind of fertilizer or nutrient that you might add to a site, that grass is going to get that benefit first. So create that mulch ring away from the tree trunk itself. I think I've got some more images. This is more of an illustration, but it takes the three main points. Is keep it away from the trunk, make sure it's only 3 to 4 inches, and then you can spread it out at least 3 feet in diameter around that tree. Because what happens is, by doing these mulch volcanoes, is you create these overly moist environments where trees or moisture is going to be held up against the tree trunk, and you create really good place for fungus to grow, good place for rodents to and you know, create their home, and they'll start eating on the trunk itself, creating some issues with the bark. You actually make it harder for the water to move through that. So if you do get a rain event, or if you do water, either that rain is going to run off the top, or it's not actually going to get into the soil itself. And so what you get is the tree roots not growing down into the soil; they'll grow up into the root systems themselves. So you want to keep it low and keep it lean, is my kind of rule of thumb. So what happens here, I'm going to go back a little bit to one of these. So what happens, especially if you use triple shredded mulch, which I think is a big no-no across the urban landscape, that's just my personal opinion. But especially with triple shredded mulch, when you pile it on like this, you create, as the mulch breaks down, it creates this kind of like impenetrable force where nothing's going to get down into it. As the shreds kind of compact into each other and overlap, it creates like this barrier, and all water is going to run off of the tree roots, you know, the tree mound itself, and out and away from the tree. So you want to avoid these mounds. You want to avoid, especially with triple shredded mulch. If you're gonna be using triple shredded mulch, you need to be a little bit more careful with the amount that you are adding to that site. And yes, it does mean you're going to have to come back more often and replenish that mulch, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you're providing more nutrients for the trees themselves, which is what you want, is improve the nutrient cycle. So let's make my way through this. Some more pictures we have. of some tree roots. This is a little bit of extreme. I mean, a pretty shallow root system itself there, but you can see the mulch ring, the bigger the tree, the bigger the mulch ring needs to be. And yes, you are going to have to go back in there and replenish it, every year, every 2 years. This is a good attempt. They did keep it away from the trunk itself. You can see that they kept the mulch away from the base of the tree, so that's good. It's a little fluffy. I'm not really sure. That's a compost mulch they added. They did add it way too much. It's probably about 3-4 inches too deep on that. But you give them props for keeping it away from the trunk itself and extending it, more than just the 2 feet from the trunk. So they're halfway there on this one. So myth number 10, and this is something I get phone calls for almost weekly from homeowners, complaining about or worried about tree roots breaking their sewer lines. And yes, it is I'm not saying that it's not a problem, that there's not a conflict. There is definitely a conflict there, but the tree roots themselves are not causing it. Tree roots are very advantageous. They're going to take advantage of weaknesses in the man-made objects, whether that's sewer lines or home foundations. So if there's a crack there or a point of weakness, the tree roots will take advantage of that and make it worse. So where if you have like a small leak or small crack, all of a sudden the tree roots find it and create a really big crack, a big leak, or even, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, will clog up that pipe itself. So we've all seen this. It's a pretty common occurrence in landscape. One of the problems with sewer lines, especially older sewer lines, is they're actually made out of clay pot material, and those crack and degrade pretty easily over time. And so the tree roots were just taking advantage of what was there and made it a much bigger problem and a much more urgent situation. But the tree roots themselves, this is the myth part. The myth part is the trees did not cause that. They just took advantage of it. Another big thing along those same lines that I wanted to include here is the tree roots destroy sidewalks. And again, yes, it is a conflict and it's a problem, but the trees aren't necessarily the problem here. The problem here is the site. A large tree should not be planted in this little 2-foot, 3-foot wide planting strip. You want to do a smaller tree there, so you don't have this kind of sidewalk conflict. So this is where a little bit of forethought and pre-planning, understanding the mature tree size of the species that you're planting there. This is where it comes into play, that right tree, right place concept that I talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. So yes, an extreme, this is a laughable moment but it does happen. So this is it is a problem, but again, this isn't necessarily the tree's fault. It's just what they do. They're growing, you put a sidewalk, 6 inches from a large growing tree, you're going to have this problem. So tree fact, roots are opportunistic and grow where the conditions are right or right enough. So as if you showed up front, you give the tree a little bit of soil, a little bit of water, and they'll survive, and they're going to do their best to make sure that they are going to survive. So we have to put a little bit of forethought in there and plan accordingly. Got some more pictures of what tree roots do, and yes, it happens. But there are precautions we can take, I guess. If we're aware of this as a problem, we can not plant trees right up against home foundations or where we know sewer lines are running from the street to the house. So you don't have these kinds of problems. There's got some good pictures. And again, whoever came up with the 2x2 tree pit should be put in jail, because this is what we've seen. It's written into a lot of municipal code as a planting spec, and you're going to have problems if you run concrete right up to the base of a tree. Nothing we can do about it. And because tree roots, as I said, they're opportunistic, they're advantageous. They're going to grow where the moisture is and where the oxygen is. And when you're dealing with sidewalks, that moisture is going to be right in between where that sidewalk concrete stops and that soil begins. That's where you're going to get the air and the water. So that's where tree roots are going to try and grow. So it's best to avoid the conflict altogether by either using new technologies as far as like silvicells or structural soils, so you still allow the planting space, or moving that sidewalk a little further away from the base of the trees, or planting smaller trees, or making the sidewalks themselves meander around the base of a tree, so you're giving some more growing space. This is the deal, something I've found when I get a lot of complaints from homeowners that worry about tree roots destroying their foundation. What they'll do is they'll grow and they'll grow till they hit that foundation, and then they're going to turn and they're going to grow along that foundation. They're not going to bust their way through. They're not jackhammers, but they will grow to the home foundation or the wall or whatever, and then they're going to turn and they're going to follow that wall until it gets out to where there's some space for them to grow. They'll continue growing along the base of that foundation or the wall itself. And it'll take advantage of any kind of man-made crack with our construction, any kind of weakness in our construction, and it'll make that problem, which was a small problem, into a huge issue. So it's just something to be aware of. You don't want to plant trees right up against homes or walls. You want to keep them 15, 25 feet away, and that way you won't have these kind of problems. And this is just a funny picture from a street up in New York, actually. You can see the roots grew in every single crack along that pavement, the paver pavement. So it's pretty, I just thought it was a funny picture to throw in there. So those are the 10 myths. I wanted to throw in an extra credit one, just to kind of reiterate. It kind of throws everything in there. A tree will reach its mature size no matter where it's planted. Yes, trees can survive almost anywhere, but should they, is one question. And yes, trees are genetically programmed to grow to a certain size. You know that oaks are going to be big trees and that red buds are going to be small trees. It's not in their genetic code to change that necessarily. But you need to be aware of what their genetic code is telling you, because large trees are going to require larger planting areas and larger rooting space. They're going to require more water availability. Smaller trees are going to have less then. So you got to think back to what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation for right tree, right place. The predicted size of a tree that a tree can achieve is directly related to the available soil and water resources that we give it. So if we know we're going to want a large tree there, you're going to need to provide a lot of space and a lot of soil. And this is a graph from Jim Urban and all of his research, where he shows that direct correlation. If you want a tree that's going to be big and larger growing, so a 15-inch diameter trunk, then you need to provide the soil volume, and it's a direct correlation. If you don't provide that soil and that water and that rooting space, that's where you create all of your conflict, and that's where we have the higher turnover rates for urban trees. They can't survive longer than 10 years if we're not going to supply the amount of rooting space it takes to get that tree to 50, 60, 80 years old. So just food for thought, something to leave you with. Just another image here from Jim Urban and his work as far as the cubic soil that's required for some of these trees and the rainwater that they provide. So if you're providing that soil space, there's more soil for that water for any kind of rain event to percolate into, and you have that natural water available to the trees, and you get a healthier canopy and a more longer lived tree itself. So those are the myths. We've got just a few minutes here for some questions. Hopefully you learned a couple of things from this that you can take back to your home or your municipality, educate other tree board members with. If you have any of these things, a few minutes here for some questions. Hopefully you learned a couple of things from this that you can take back to your home or your municipality, educate other tree board members with. If you have any of these things written into your municipal code as far as planting specs that may contradict what we go in here, now it might be a time to kind of revisit that and create some flexibility in your code, but that's a whole other discussion. We won't go there. So now's the time for questions. Since we're on a computer here, we're gonna, if you type in your questions into the chat function, I will kind of work my way through it. Here's my email address if you guys want to follow up with anything, if you want any kind of the background research for any of the things that I talked about or discussed, I can easily send that to you. I will also send out for folks that were wanting printable, like a PDF version of my presentation. I'm more than happy to share that with you. Just shoot me an email and I can send you a PDF version of today's presentation. So we're going to kind of walk through to see what kind of questions people might have. Do I have a citation for Jim Urban's work? I do, and I'm going to make a note of that, Jeffrey, and I can try and send that when I'll make myself a note here. I'll try and send that out to folks maybe when I send out the notice that we have the recorded webinar. But while you guys are typing out some questions, I'm going to switch back over to a different presentation here with the ISA credits. So if you are a certified arborist and you're wanting some education credits for today, you just need to take note of that, the PP-18-083, and that's what you would use as a self-reporting. Let's see what other questions we've got. I'm going to leave that up there on the screen for you guys for a little bit. I don't see any other questions coming through at this point, but I'll give you guys a minute or two. I'm going to scroll to the next slide. We do have some other webinars coming up in the near future that I'll bring everybody's attention to. Our next one's on May 16th, Municipal Perspective of Trees in Development and Construction. We're going to have a couple of municipal arborists coming on talking about their experience with working with trees in construction and tree protection. And then we have two others later on in the year in July and October that hopefully you guys can join us for. But I'll put back up the ISA Certified Arborist credits. Let's see. Got some other questions. So what's the best way to support large tree canopies as far as cabling? I'm assuming you're talking about mature trees. So once you have a mature tree in the landscape, if you start to notice that the canopy is, or you have some weak limb structure or really heavy limbs you want to try and brace, there is a cabling mechanism you can put in that can stabilize those tree limbs. It takes a fair amount of effort. You're going to have to hire a qualified arborist that can come in and install that equipment, the cabling system. But it can keep a tree large, if you have a really large, mature, beautiful tree that you want to keep around for another 10, 20 years, that is definitely a way to do that. You have to get an arborist company. I know that Bartlett does it and Davey does it. Those are two universal tree care companies, but there are definitely others that are state by state that offer that capability. And what you would do if you do use a cabling system, I recommend that you check it annually. You kind of take a look at to make sure you don't have any kind of increased decay at that cabling site itself, but you get it checked pretty regularly so that you can take care of any other issues that might come up. Any other questions that I might be missing? I'm not sure. I see somebody had a question about planting on a slope. I'm not sure what that question specifically was, but if as far as how to what the planting hole itself should look like. So if you're planting on a slope, a steeper slope, you will have one side of the tree that kind of sticks out of the slope more because you want to make sure that the tree is straight up and down and not with the slope. So you might have a kind of a planting bed that sticks out a little bit from the slope and creates kind of like a step pattern on that slope itself. It depends on the size of the tree and the severity of the slope itself. But there are diagrams and specs that you can get out there from for planting on slopes. But I don't see any other questions coming in at this time. Again, my email is on here as well as my phone number. So if you think of questions or don't want to ask it on the computer system itself, you can always just shoot me an email and I'll respond to you.